Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis Chang. And the Good Faith Podcast is a production of Redeeming Babel. And it's where friends who follow Jesus help each other make sense of the world. And the world is about to hit the presidential election, and we all could use some help in making sense of this momentous event. And the perfect person to help me do that is, of course, my founding friend, David French. David, welcome back again to the Good Faith Podcast.
Well, thanks, Curtis. It's always great to be here. Happy to do this on, is this going to be the last Good Faith Podcast before the election?
Yeah, we will have, this is it. This is the last, last full one. So this is it for us to actually try to help each other and help our listeners make sense of this upcoming election. David, you have written a lot about it. You have some great thoughts. We're going to want to plumb your thoughts. But before we get to the realm of thoughts, David, I want to get to the realm of feeling. David, emotionally, how are you feeling? How would you describe your emotional state at this moment?
I would say surprisingly calm. Okay. Look, there's a kind of liberation in a weird way, and just not having any idea how this thing is going to how this thing's going to come out. People ask me constantly, who's going to win? And I say, well, here's the real answer. The real answer, if I told you who's going to win, you should immediately discount everything that I say, because nobody really knows. There are people who have more educated guesses and less educated guesses. And there are voices I'm reading who seem more reasonable and less reasonable. But the bottom line is, the people I respect the most who follow this stuff, who do this for a living, they talk properly in terms of probabilities, not in terms of certainties. And even the people, let's suppose you're looking at Nate Silver, and maybe a couple of days ago, Nate Silver said it's 55% chance Trump, 45% chance Harris. What that means is you should be not surprised at all how this comes out one way or the other. And then you're down to things like instincts and vibes and people overreading early vote returns when 2024 is a different election from 2020. And so there is actually something that has allowed about the closeness of this, oddly enough, that has sort of allowed me to kind of just say, like everyone else in America, on Tuesday evening, I'm going to be tuning in with extreme curiosity and with a lot of concern, no question, a lot of concern. But I am surprisingly, if you had told me at this point a year ago it would be this close and you're going to be pretty calm about it, I would have said no. I'll be really stressed. But no, the answer is I actually feel pretty calm about it at this moment. That does not mean I don't think that the stakes have lowered.
Yeah.
There's just, we're all different people, and there's something about the closeness of this, the inability to sort of see through the fog of war, so to speak, to understand the true state of things. It is sort of putting me in a position of, well, we just have no choice but to wait and see.
Okay, that's really interesting, because I am also finding myself surprisingly, I would say, not anxious. And I've been trying to understand why that is. I think it might be related, but slightly different from you. For me, I get anxious when I think there's uncertainty about whether it's going to be bad or whether it's going to be good. Like, that's what makes me anxious. Like, things are hinging between good or bad. I don't know which way it's going to go. But I think the reason why I'm calm, David, is I think regardless of what happens, it's going to be bad. So it's just a question of how bad it's going to be. And that actually puts me into less in a state of anxiety and more like sad resignation. So the best analogy I would have would be how I feel before I have to go in for a root canal. And I have horrible teeth, David. This is something that apparently you are coming to share more of my reality in this, but I've had multiple root canals. So I sort of know what to expect with a root canal. And basically the range of outcomes is bad to really bad is what that experience is going to be like. Like in the best possible scenario, it's a simple root canal. It's kind of roughly at the surface. And I know I'm going to have a bad few days of soreness and pain in recovery. Now, it can get really bad. They can really discover how bad the rot goes. And so it's like an extensive root canal. They need to do like gum reconstruction and so forth. And it gets really, really bad. So by analogy, how I view this election is my ardently hoped desired outcome is Trump loses, Harris wins. But even then, it's going to be bad, I think. Like all the signals point that it's going to be a very close election, even if Harris wins, and that Trump and his team has sent out strong signals that quite likely this is going to be contested. There's going to be a season of extreme instability where people are hanging in the balance of what is he going to do? Is he going to actually concede the results? So that's in the best possible scenario. And then, of course, if he wins, then given where we've seen his rhetoric go in terms of, to me, seemingly increasingly unhinged, more racist, more a sense that institutions and norms that we value are going to get further eroded in his administration, then it's just going to get really, really bad. So I think that's in a strange way why I'm not anxious, because I just know it's going to be bad. It's just a question of how bad.
Well, that's an interesting point. Let me give you a preview of something I'm writing right now, which is I'm increasingly of the view, Curtis, that you and I came of age in something of a historical blip in American life that we took to be the norm.
Yeah.
And so if you think about it, I'm 15 years old in 1984. I'm 20 years old when the Berlin Wall comes down. Okay. I'm 22 when the Soviet Union ends. And so there's this period of time in my formative years where we're in the first post-civil rights generation, post-civil rights movement generation. So you've just come out of this. Now, again, I'm not saying that the civil rights generation solved race in America, but you're coming from a generation that made a leaps and bounds improvement in race. Move into the defeat of our principal geopolitical foe without a world war, okay? And then moving into a period of hyper prosperity and hyper power in the United States. So moving from the election of Ronald Reagan through the end of Bill Clinton's second term and before 9/11, you had this period of, a decade, more of 20 or so years, which was a period of what in the moment felt like just very substantial national progress. Okay.
Now, and stability, right?
And stability. And then overlay that with the fact that I'm also coming out of a place and a geographic region and a church and a community that has always had a rosy view of America, or often has a rosy view. So I was raised on a rosy view. I experienced sort of a series of major historical moments of progress. Okay. And that's all during my formative years. And it's sort of easy to think, okay, well, this is America. Yeah. And then we then begin to have a series of shocks. So you have 9/11, you have the Great Recession. Then we had the rise of populist anger and aggression and all of these things. And then at that same time, many of us who come from my same church background and my same geographic background and ideological background are learning more about our history. And learning more that it wasn't this sort of unbroken forward moving arrow towards goodness, that there was a giant amount of backsliding in large periods of instability and division. And so when you look at it from the longer view, you realize, okay, wait a minute. I came of age in a time that gave me, in many ways, perhaps a false sense of stability and virtue about the country.
Yeah.
But then when you have the longer view, what we're witnessing right now fits within that longer view. And so, that's concerning. That's alarming. Absolutely. At the same time, you see this and it helps you make more sense of what's happening. And whenever we can make sense of something, it actually calms us a bit in an interesting way. It's funny. You can you can sometimes get bad news at a doctor, but if they're finally diagnosing what ails you,
Hmm.
you can be very concerned about the diagnosis, but at the same time feel sort of this sense of relief that it makes sense.
At least we know what we're dealing with
At
now.
least we know what we're dealing with. And so
Yeah.
I think, Curtis, that's where I am. I feel like I understand what we're dealing with.
Yeah.
That doesn't make me that doesn't make me less concerned, but it does provide that sort of sense of okay, we've been here before. Here's what that means. Here is how we got through it in the past, perhaps. Maybe some of those lessons can come in helpful. But yeah, for me, it really is. I'm beginning to understand. I feel like I'm understanding more about my own country in
Yeah.
full.
Well, and it sounds like that understanding how privileged of a life we had growing up and how
Yeah.
extraordinarily privileged that was, both in terms of American history, but really
Mm-hmm.
world history
Yes.
and
Yes.
world context as well. So I think of myself. So I immigrated to this country when I was 3. So went through the exact. I think we're like almost like a year apart, right? So we went through the exact same kind of formative experiences. But I forget what my parents went through. My parents, born in China in the 20s and 10s, and grew up in the 30s in the middle of a Japanese invasion, then a civil war, then refugees from mainland China to Taiwan, and then Taiwan to America. Think of how unstable their world
Oh,
was for most of their life. They lost everything. Both sides of their family lost everything in the Japanese invasion, the Civil War, and then the refugee status, leaving mainland China. That's just one generation removed. That's my parents. And how different of an expectation that my parents have and I have in terms of what we just deserve in terms of stability, prosperity, and all of that. And so I think that's a really helpful reminder for us that we have been living through an incredibly privileged era that is not the norm, certainly in world history and even in American history, and even in the periods of seeming stability in American history. What you're saying is actually underneath that, many people were experiencing a much darker version of American history than white Protestants were, for instance. So I think that's really helpful, David. So let's talk about that.
yeah.
Do you think then we are entering a season, and that is going to be accentuated by this election, a season, maybe even an era of increasing instability? And if so, what does that mean for us, especially as followers of Jesus?
So I think we're going to. I if I, to the extent that I can predict this, because there is a scenario. I can imagine a scenario in which, say, there's a Harris win, and this is the second consecutive Donald Trump loss, and there's no real evidence that sort of the MAGA people not named Donald Trump have have had any real success. In fact, there's a lot of evidence that the MAGA people not named Donald Trump have done much worse than Donald Trump. They don't have the same sort of magnetism that he has. They don't have the same sort of history and popularity that Trump brought with him into this whole thing. So it's not out of the question that you could have a Trump loss and then sort of a GOP that says, let's not do that again. Okay. That's not out of the question. I think, though, at this point, it's highly unlikely.
Yeah.
And the reason why I think it's highly unlikely is that people have changed. Not oh, people have changed in the sense that individuals have changed, but the personnel has changed
Yeah.
as far as the people who are the leading voices. So for example, if Donald Trump loses, a person like Jack Posobiec, who's a hardcore MAGA internet personality, doesn't suddenly lose all 2 million
Yeah.
of his followers, right?
Right.
Or Charlie
Right.
Kirk doesn't lose all his millions of followers, or Candace Owens doesn't lose all her millions of followers. They're still going to have followers. Now, the question is, how much will those followers continue to follow them? But that's just scratching the surface, Curtis. If you talk about the changes at the grassroots, we're talking about very much, you're talking about very there's been a big change at the grassroots as far as who runs a party committee,
Yeah.
who runs the state party, who runs a legislative caucus. So these kinds of these things have changed. And those people would either have to go away or they would have to have a change of heart themselves. And the level of vitriol within sort of MAGA against traditional Republicans is huge. It's huge. And so I don't think that there's any real sign that Charlie Kirksey is going to wake up in the morning and say, well, dang it, low character populism just, that doesn't work. Let me go high character limited government, whatever. That's just not in the card. So I think that we're looking at a period where the party on the right is just different in character. And the party on the left, by the way, is different in character because the party on the left has moved from something very much more ideological into something that's more coalitional. So if you have AOC and Liz Cheney voting for the same candidate, that's the textbook definition of a coalition, okay? MAGA is a movement. The Democratic Party right now is a coalition. After 2019 and 2020, sort of the great awakening element of Democratic Party politics is really fallen by the wayside. And you can tell that by how the Democratic Party and Democratic Party activists are not holding Kamala Harris's feet to the fire on things like the Green New Deal or defund the police or some of these hot button issues from 2019. So it has really sunk in with a lot of people that the party of the left now is a coalition. The party on the right is a movement. And I don't see any evidence that either one of those things is just going to suddenly change post-election.
Well, and the nature of a coalition is, I think it intrinsically is more stable because you have to actually make room for very different viewpoints. And so you're not lurching kind of in extreme directions. So I think that's part of the why I think it's going to be bad, because even with a coalitional win, it's a squeaked out win over the opposing party that is very much really, by historical standards, an extremist movement that has garnered at least the votes of close to half of the electorate. And so that intrinsically tells you we're in an unstable era. We're in an unstable era where this could be the result, where a stable coalitional party has to just eke out a razor thin win against essentially a extremist national movement. And that's an unstable situation, David. So if that's the truth, David, I want to move our conversation to, okay, that's going to be the reality. Let's start making peace, so to speak, with that reality, especially as Christians. What does that mean? How do we as Christians engage in a season and perhaps an era of political stability, rather than kicking against the goads and just being mad about this, lamenting, thinking, how could this happen? I mean, we have to go through that process, of course. But I think at some point we need to move off of the kicking against the goads, against this nostalgic longing for an era of stability that just is not coming back anytime soon, and say, what does this mean for us now? What would be some initial guideposts that we need to align ourselves with?
Well, here's one thought that I have when you're talking about this is, the Bible speaks of the great cloud of witnesses. That's the great cloud of the Christians who've gone before us.
Yeah.
And right now I can see the great cloud of witnesses saying to American Christians, welcome to our party, which is we spent our whole lives from birth to death in places that were much less stable, much less prosperous, much less just than the nation that you're in right now.
Yeah.
And you may be entering into a period of time that actually looks a lot like the life that most Christians lived. Yeah. Quite frankly, most Christians lived. And I feel like that's a clarifying thought, that if you might be moving back into this situation, which is a situation much more like where most Christians live, then you can begin to get, again, it's not that you're fine with it. Yeah. I'm mourning this. I'm grieving this. Okay. Yeah. But I'm not entitled to the life that I'd had before. Okay. That is not my right. It is not my right as a Christian to live in a nation that is moving towards justice, that is moving towards prosperity. That's not my entitlement. And here's the other interesting thing that kind of gives me just, this is a personal thing, and I don't know if some of the folks listening are like this as well. And this is going to sound strange, but I feel like my faith suffers when I feel like I am content and part of the majority culture.
Yeah.
Okay. My faith is more vibrant when I feel that I'm in the minority culture, and that when I feel like times are more uncertain. And doesn't mean that I want uncertain times. Okay. It's not like I should sit here and go, yeah, I want national instability so I can feel closer to God. No, no, no. My answer should be, I should want national stability and still feel close to God. However, I will say that for a lot of Christians, adversity is very clarifying.
Yeah.
I know for me, it was one of the most important times in my life to move from my Christian college to Harvard Law School, where I was definitely in the minority and definitely not in a beloved minority, and faced.
You were getting shouted down in the classrooms.
I was getting shouted down. And so, but for me, that was clarifying as to who I was, what I believed, right? And so I think we're going through a lot of those clarifying moments right now. And there is a certain degree of purpose, clarifying purpose that occurs in that circumstance.
I think of this in terms of an analogy. I'm going to offer a personal analogy and then a historical church history analogy here. Mm-hmm. So the personal analogy is fitness training. So I've seen the same fitness trainer for 15 years. He's awesome. And the reason he's awesome is he does not let me get complacent and stable. So because the nature of fitness is such that if you do the same exercise that you get really good at, really comfortable at, you plateau. Your body just starts getting kind of making peace. It's like, oh, this is great. I know how to do this. And my trainer is awesome because he's just constantly mixing it up and purposefully injecting instability, like literally instability on a platform or an exercise where my body has to work harder to actually deal with this new context of instability. And that's actually how I get more fit. And so I think there's a spiritual, that's an analogy, a metaphor for spiritual growth, that whilst there is a true gift to stability and predictability, there's a downside, is what you're saying, David. And that downside is we don't actually have to stretch, work, struggle, clarify spiritually in the ways that we can only do, I think, in a period of instability. And again, not like you said, not that instability is a good, but I think there is a redemptive opportunity for spiritual growth. So that's the personal analogy. Let me give one from church history that I think, David, speaks to what you're talking about. So just a quick sort of, for beginners, church history thing. Remember, Christianity grew as a minority movement, persecuted and oppressed within the Roman Empire. And it grew rapidly precisely because of how countercultural it was, how it didn't fit with the dominant culture and ethos of the Greco-Roman society. So it cared for discarded girls that would be thrown away normally by the Greco-Roman culture. It cared for the poor. It cared for the sick and dying. When plagues would hit, it would be the Christians that would stay. The sociologist Rodney Stark, describes all of this early, 150 years of Christianity that he explains as sociologically, in addition to the spiritual reasons, for the dramatic rise of Christianity. However, it became something of a victim of its own success. As it grew and it became more popular, it became part of the dominant Greco-Roman culture and society, such that if you wanted to advance in our society, it became an advantage to become a Christian. And it eventually culminated or hit a inflection point with Constantine, right? When the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, where he believes that Christ gave him the victory over his Roman political opponents. And he really then ushers in Christianity as an established religion, such that his successor, Theodosius, actually makes it the official state religion of the Roman Empire around the turn of the 400s. So that's all of what Christianity goes through. It becomes part of an established order. It's stable, it's predictable. To become a Christian is to be in alignment with the government and with society. And then what happens, David? The Roman Empire begins to show its cracks and its weaknesses. 410, the Goths invade and sack Rome. Now, if you think January 6th was a disturbing, traumatic experience, like, the sack of Rome in 410 was like January 6th multiplied by 1,000-fold. And it's so shocking and so traumatic to Christians because they have come to think of their own stability of their faith tied with the stability of the Roman Empire. St. Jerome writes that when he hears about the sack of Rome, he can't eat, breathe, or remember anything. It's so viscerally shocking to him. But what that triggers, that moment of crisis and stability, is Augustine. And I've written about this. If you're interested in reading about this, Engaging Unbelief, a book written 25 years ago, but still true. Augustine, it is a moment of clarification for Augustine because that's when he writes the City of God. It's directly in response to the fall of Rome. And he realizes, okay, we cannot pin our hopes on Rome and Roman Empire. There's the city of God, which is the people of God and the movement of God throughout history, the church especially at the center of it, and the city of man. And they're intermixed and intermingled, and they depend on one another in various ways, but they are not the same thing. And they will ultimately, at the end, at the great judgment, at what we, David, call the after party of Jesus, will get sorted out, and they will not be the same, and the city of God will reign triumphant. That clarifying moment sustains Christianity for hundreds of years, even to this day. It's crucial. And I don't think Augustine comes to that clarity without the sack of Rome, without that crisis and period of instability that he has. So I think we're in potentially a season where that kind of clarification, that kind of insight and realization that could actually be really important, not just for this moment, but for our succeeding generations to inherit from us. That's the opportunity we have, is that kind of clarification that only instability brings, because it disrupts false stability that we've built our faith on. Can you imagine that scenario, David?
Yeah, no, and I think it's also important to note that the triumph of Christendom is not the triumph of Christianity. Those are very different things, because if Donald Trump wins, there's going to be an enormous number of Christian voices who will say, we won. We won. You're going to see the Christian nationalist argument swell, even though Trump has spent, much of his race running away from that, disclaiming Project 2025, making the platform functionally pro-choice. Trump is, but at the same time, he's been running towards it in other ways. I don't know if you saw, there was a big picture over the last few days where just a giant pile of people are laying hands on him and praying for him. And so there will be this sense amongst a lot of people that Christianity won if Donald Trump wins. Well, there will be a version of Christendom that will have won if Donald Trump wins. And that's not the same thing. And for those who are, have not heard sort of previous Good Faiths where we talk about this, Christendom really is the institutions, the secular institutions of the faith. It's sort of the power of the faith exercised through secular means. In Europe prior to, World War I, World War II, in Europe, a few hundred years ago, Christendom was a very formal thing. It was the union of church and state. Here in the United States, we don't really have that, but we do have very powerful institutions that exercise a lot of earthly power. And that's our version of Christendom. And those institutions, that institutional force is generally, although not exclusively, it's generally arrayed on the side of Donald Trump. And a lot of people will interpret a Trump victory as a triumph of Christendom. But there have been many points in history, Curtis, where Christendom has been ascendant, but Christians feel isolated and persecuted, and are in fact isolated and persecuted. If you think about some of the martyrdom of the Reformation era, that's one set of Christians burning another set of Christians to death.
Right.
Right. Hard to see Christianity in that.
Yeah.
You can see Christendom in that, sort of the exertion of power. But this is a very, again, nothing here is really new at all.
We're talking about how followers of Jesus can prepare ourselves spiritually as we head towards election day and all the potential to probable instability it brings. We've been talking about the redemptive gift of instability, how it actually can produce a sense of clarity, a sense of growth that isn't quite as possible in moments of stability and where Christians feel comfortable. David, I want to give you another example at the individual level here, and I
Okay.
want you to talk about this because we can. I do think I'm really interested in seeing what this next era produces theologically. Like, I think we are going to need our own versions of Augustine, our own
Mhm.
versions of City of God, which produce the sense of clarity of what the historic, true biblical faith is in contradistinction to a cultural accommodation and a cultural stability that we've gotten used to. I think there will be actually a tremendous amount of creative ferment and insights that will not only serve the church in this moment where we're under pressure, but could be an inheritance we give on to subsequent generations, just like the city of God was. But I want to bring this down to the individual level. Like, what's the opportunity for individual spiritual growth among our listeners now as we head into a moment of instability? And when I was thinking about this, David, was I was thinking of the diary of Anne Frank. So I read this when I was in high school, like many people, high schoolers are when they're assigned that. And when I read stories of another era that was full of dramatic crisis, threat, I mean, incredible instability, I can't help but like picture myself in that situation and think, what would I have done in that context? And I think that's actually an important way in which we grow spiritually. Is this is why reading of history, reading of church history, reading of biographies, it's so valuable, at least for me, because it's a way for me to expand the range of scenarios that are like a test, a question that's posed to, well, what's in me? What's my character? What's my level of faith and courage and so forth? So reading the diary of Anne Frank, obviously there's the courage and bravery of Anne Frank herself, but there's the context of the family that sheltered Anne Frank, who were Dutch Catholics, the Geese, John and Miep Geese, and just the ways that they sacrificed their privilege and stability that they could have had if they just looked the other way. But instead, in this moment, they discovered a faith and a commitment in Jesus that led them to do some amazing things. It was actually Miep Gees who preserved Anne Frank's diary and actually made it, accessible, gave it as a gift, an inheritance to all subsequent generations. And it strikes me that I just wonder what's that version for us that in this moment we may be called on individually and in local communities to dig deeper and find out what's in us because the situation is more unstable, more unstable, more threatening than we would have otherwise had growing up in our stable, sort of environments. And I was thinking especially about immigrants and migrants and refugees because I'm an immigrant myself. And then you can't, of course, hopefully not realize that so much of the Trump's campaign and what he seems to want to do is even further demonize immigrants and migrants. Obviously, pay attention to what happened with the Haitian immigrants in Ohio and how that's been a weaponized issue. And I fear that we are going to, as part of this era of instability and crisis, it's almost always the most vulnerable that suffer the most in a period of instability. This is actually why stability is a gift, because it's actually in periods of instability that the vulnerable, the poor, the defenseless are most under threat. And I just wonder what that's going to mean for immigrants and refugees. And David, you've stayed in our guest house, and that guest house we've increasingly been made available for Afghan refugees. I think we've just had our third family, and I'm beginning to wonder if Trump wins, is part of the Chang family sort of digging deep is we've got to take more risks in terms of using that place for who knows what will happen in terms of what the plight of immigrants, refugees will in a Trump administration. And this may be our little small version of the Jan and Miep Geese opportunity to find out what's actually in us, and not only to find out, but to grow what's in us, because we have to deal with this a new situation and the threats and the opportunities that it comes. David, Can you fill out that picture? What might be other things that just individual Christians may have to dig deep and find out what's in us as if Trump wins and there's a new administration and a new sort of set of threats that emerge.
Yeah. So I think of it, I kind of think of two things at once. One is lean towards protecting the vulnerable on and look, in that sense, I really want us to encourage to think more about like what you were talking about, Curtis. Here are specific families that I can help. Here are specific people who I can help. Now, that doesn't mean forsaking public advocacy, but we need to remember that we have only a very, very, very small amount of influence over a large number of people, but we can have a lot of influence over a small number of people. And sometimes we organize our efforts inversely, where we spend most of the time where we have the least influence and the least amount of time where we have the most influence. So I sort of think about ordering towards leaning in towards protecting and defending vulnerable people in your ranks, in your community. And the other one is lean towards disrupting Christian think, because a lot of what is happening, to be honest, is there are a lot of Christians right now who are so marinating in one point of view that they're the fish that doesn't even know that it's wet.
Yeah.
And so there's just a lot of people who are being swept along in an immense tide. And one of the reasons why they're being swept along is that in their frame of reference, this is the only way Christians are behaving. Okay. And why is it one of the reasons why in frame of reference, this is the only way Christians are behaving? It's because the Christians who disagree, say, with this giant move towards Trumpism are choosing, often for very good reason, not to say anything. They might be sitting next to you in the pew and absolutely keeping their mouth shut, because saying anything creates problems. It's like getting shocked with a cattle prod. I mean, it's really something else. But it's fascinating how much just a respectful pushback towards people of goodwill can make a difference. I'll give you a good example of somebody, we both know somebody very well who was recently at a church where the talk was about the quote thread of the LGBTQ agenda. So that was the whole course of the talk, and with a big emphasis sort of in the whole course of the service towards the election. And so Nancy asked a question of one of the people afterwards. And the question was, would you vote for Donald Trump if he was gay? Or if he, and the answer was no, absolutely not. And then the next question was, but he's been found responsible for sex abuse. So you're saying that some being gay is worse than sexually abusing a woman.
Yeah.
Now, how is that, help me reconcile that, right? Help me reconcile that. And the interesting thing is, if somebody's not a hardcore MAGA partisan, and they actually have an open heart, that triggers a very interesting conversation. Yeah. Even, and again, you're not attacking them. You're just asking, you're asking questions and some respectful pushback. And that can trigger some really, really interesting conversations. Yeah. And I think we underestimate the extent to which a lot of people in our community are kind of along for a ride. Yeah. I'll give you another good example, and this happened to me directly. I was talking to a guy, nice guy, evangelical guy, doesn't like January 6th at all. And he said, I didn't like January 6th, but the bottom line is the only person who was murdered was Ashley Babbitt. This is the woman who was shot as she was trying to break into the area that contained the speaker's office and all of this. And I said, it's interesting that you think that she was murdered, and I said, well, let's just explore that. And we had a really nice conversation. I said, why do you think she was murdered? And he said, well, she was just breaking in the window. I said, well, let's suppose you're in your office and there's a group of people outside and they're pounding on the window saying they want to kill you or hang you. And one of them breaks through the window. here in the state of Tennessee, what do you have the right to do? And he said, oh, right. Okay. I would have the
You would
right.
stand and defend. It was what it was
It's a
called, stand and
stand your
defend.
ground. It's a
Stand your ground.
stand your
That's
ground
right.
state.
Yeah, yeah,
And so,
yeah.
and I said, so the question is, does the Speaker of the House have a duty to flee in front of the mob, or does the Speaker of the House and the American government have a right to stand its ground against a violent mob? And he said, I've never thought of it like that. And so it was just a very simple, quick conversation. But we're constantly underestimating, in my view, the extent to which a lot of people are kind of swept up in a current.
Yeah.
So that's why I say one thing, lean into protecting the vulnerable. And the other one is lean against the current and your own community.
And by the way, if you hear David's example and you think, well, that's David French, New York Times columnist, able to come up, or Nancy French, able to come up with these kinds of clever ways to disrupt the flow. You can do it yourself. This is why David, Nancy, and I created the after party. It's a way so that you don't have to come up with it on the fly, but you can create a setting, a context where the conversation is teed up and structured for you in your Christian circles, in your church, in your small group, your Bible study, maybe just even in your family, to go through an experience where I think that's that kind of questioning, gentle questioning and disruption of the sort of dangerous and destructive flow towards MAGA can be diverted, at least given a different pathway to run on. One of the just wonderful things that we've experienced is how many people have said to us, like, oh my gosh, thank you for showing us that all Christians aren't this way. Just by virtue of this course being available, them being able to take it, them being able to experience a different way of thinking about politics. It doesn't have to be that you have to articulate it all yourself. You can just take enough risk to invite people into an experience like that. And David, Russell, myself, and the way the course is structured will help structure the conversation to tee up those kinds of moments.
And can I interject real quick?
Yeah.
We've been talking mainly about like what happens if sort of MAGA wins.
Yeah.
No one should think that happy days are here again for Christianity if Kamala Harris wins. This is not, so there are circumstances where, for example, there was some pretty disturbing stuff that she said about the religious liberty of abortion opponents recently, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
There is no scenario in this election where Jesus is winning. Okay.
Right.
So there will be challenges for believers in a Harris administration. There will be challenges for believers in a Trump administration. I have been very public in where I think, where my conscience is telling me where I should vote. My conscience is telling me what's better or worse for the country. But we do not have, we do not have heaven versus hell here, right?
That's right. Yeah.
This is not Dante's paradise versus Dante's inferno. That's not the situation. And often we tend to think about politics like this, where, and you will see it. I guarantee you. You will see it. I guarantee you on election night, you will see the winning side. You will see a level of ecstasy that is actually like quasi-religious in nature.
Yeah. Yeah.
Beware of that. Do not give in to that. Even if the candidate that you think might lose wins and it's the biggest surprise and you think you've saved democracy, you've saved the country, do not give in to this sort of ecstatic view. As much as we also say, don't give into the catastrophic view. Don't give into the ecstatic view, because this is not a situation where one party winning or the other ushers anything in that looks in any that looks in any way sort of like the kingdom of heaven here.
Absolutely. I mean, or another way to put it is, to our point about lean into protecting the vulnerable and defenseless. If Harris wins, there's a different set of defenseless and vulnerable, like the unborn, that we have to really protect, or those who, otherwise might be suffering from a democratic regime of in ways in which they choose and pick kind of who is the favored side and so forth. And
Mhm.
so this is the call of Christians in this moment, is that in either side, right, we have to defend the vulnerable, defend the defenseless. And like you said, we want to lean against the tide. And who knows what tide will be that we'll need to lean against if Harris wins, right? There will be its own version of a current that is going to be need to be resisted. So, yeah.
And I also think maybe a little bit of what I'm feeling there is there's a point in time and when we're entering into adversity.
Yeah.
If we enter into adversity with a sense of virtuous purpose, it can be energizing.
Yeah.
Even as it can also be terrifying in some ways. You know, to take an extreme example, and I just want to be super, very triple clear about this. I'm not comparing the post-election period to going to war. Okay. But I am saying, even in the most extreme circumstance of going to war, when I was flying into Iraq on November 22nd, 2007, I felt two things at the same time. I felt a sense of real raw fear that I'd never felt before in my life, just to be honest. Like, just, this real sense of what are you doing here? Like, what? But at the same time, I felt a sense of burning purpose.
Yeah.
This is where I am supposed to be. This is what I am supposed to be doing. And so I think that you can hold both of these things in your mind at the same time. One is, I'm really concerned. We are looking at a hard time no matter what, whether it's greater degree or lesser degree, everything is pointing towards instability. Okay. At the same time, I can feel a sense of virtuous purpose as I approach this trial. And that sense of virtuous purpose can provide us with a kind of deep joy.
Yeah.
It really can. It really, think back in your lives to the point where you felt like it was very hard, but you were doing the right thing. If it was at that same, it's rare the person who says, I didn't get any joy or satisfaction or meaning out of doing the right thing in an adverse time. Most of us would say, in many ways, that's when I felt most alive. That's when I felt like I had the greatest sense of purpose.
And that's the invitation for us, for all of you listening, that really the preparation, probably more important than who you're going to vote for, the preparation is to begin asking that question. Even in each of the scenario, whoever wins, what will be my purpose? What is my calling in this moment? Along some of the suggested ways that we've talked about, but maybe you have your own way that you say, in this moment, I need to lean in this direction and be, even if you don't know the answer to that question of what is my virtuous God called purpose, to begin asking that question in this moment. And I think especially, David, like you said, asking about it most in the realms that you have the most agency and influence and relationship in, which most likely is going to be in your immediate circles. What is God calling you in your circles right now? For this last section, David, I want to actually talk about the election day itself, like that day, David.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let me ask you first, give us a picture of how are you going to be living that day? I mean, obviously we're not all New York Times writers, but just give us a window of that. And then I want to talk about how all of us can do our version of living our best day possible on election day.
My day is going to be normal and then not normal. So Tuesdays are my busiest day of the week. I start with a 9 a.m. class in Nashville for lifelong learners. Which is run through Lipscomb University, where I teach. And it's one of my favorite things I do, Curtis. It's a group of people. I think the median age is well north of 70, but we have people ranging from the 20s to the 90s in the class. And it's just people who want to learn more about the country. So last year, I had a lifelong learners class on the philosophies, plural, of the foundings, plural. Ton of fun. This time it's called Why Did American Politics Go Insane? And it's a 5-part course that's not about this politician or that politician, but the structural forces that have brought us to this moment. And so I teach that. Then later in the afternoon, I teach an undergrad course on the same topic, but in much more depth. So my lifelong learners class is 90 minutes, 5 sessions. The undergraduate course is 2.5 hours on a Tuesday afternoon, late early evening for the whole semester. And it really is trying to help these young students understand why the world is the way the world is right now. Yeah. That's what, and so that's going to be all normal, except that I'm going to ask both classes to enter into an electoral college pool. And then as soon as I get back to my house at 6 o'clock, then the whole rest of the evening is going to be live blogging, podcast recording, real-time analysis. And I'm supposed to be available until 2 a.m., Curtis.
Oh, good Lord. Okay.
So it's going to be a day that's going to start about 9 in the morning and it's going to end at the earliest at 2 in the morning the next day. Heck, I'd be optimistic to be in bed at 2 a.m. But
all right, David, that's your life. Now just give some advice. Put on your pastoral hat here. For our listeners, what's some advice you would give them for how to go through election day?
Okay. Let me make this, let me tailor this to your temperament. Okay. Are you super anxious? Are you super anxious? If you are a super anxious person, what I'm going to recommend is that you actually just tune in episodically. Okay. So maybe there's a favorite show you're binging. Just decide Tuesday night is binge night for the latest British crime drama. Okay. And so, or Rings of Power. So I'm going to watch an episode. Then I'm going to turn on whatever your favorite channel is, or go to the New York Times website or whatever, see the status, take a deep breath, watch for an hour, see the status, take a deep breath. But if you're somebody who's dispositionally kind of anxious, I would really encourage you not to go through the twists and turns of Twitter or social media more broadly, because it is right now, social media is just a dumpster fire of rampant speculation, disinformation, rumors. I mean, you can read smart people right now who look at the same data set on early voting and have 180-degree opposite conclusions to it. I mean, it will drive you nuts. So if you are dispositionally anxious, really measure it out in small doses and spread them out, because there's going to be twists and turns over the course of the night. If you're somebody who is not dispositionally anxious, what I would say is create a very curated list. If you're on social media, a specifically curated list of your most trusted voices, and then only follow that list of people. And so, pick people on the right that you really respect, people on the left, election analysts that you really respect, and just really laser in on those. Don't go to the general feed. The general feed is going to be insane. It will be so hard to separate out signal from noise. It's going to be so hard to cut through the fog of war. So find trusted voices, follow them for the twists and turns. We're going to live blog, for example, I believe. Yeah, we're going to have a live real-time reaction at the New York Times. So, I'd invite you to follow that. But it really depends on who you are as a person. If you're really, really anxious, I would encourage you not to be following minute by minute. Above all, do not go to the New York Times needle. The needle that's like going this way and that way, minute by just say, not today, Satan, for the needle. I mean, but
man, that needle killed me in 2016. That just yanked me emotionally all over the place.
But if you're somebody who follows it moment by moment, it can be super interesting and helpful because it's a sophisticated model that goes into the needle and all of that. So that, that kind of super granular real-time analysis absolutely has its place. It's not for everybody.
Yeah, that's great. I love that advice. Know yourself, know what you need, know what's going to make you feel able to go through this with some sense of stability and some sense of perspective. Guard yourself well, I think, from things that are going to take you off of that sense of being centered. Of course, I also want to really encourage all of us to be praying. So you can join us and prepare for that on Monday before election. day, we are having a day, I think it's the noon Pacific Eastern time, with David, Russell, myself, other guests like Charlie Dates and Tish Harrison Warren, where we're going to be praying. So you can join us in praying in the day before election, and also perhaps pick up some rhythms or practices or specific prayers that I would encourage you to adopt, not just the day before, but the day of, and perhaps the days after election, to learn to pray. This is a spiritual opportunity for us to learn to pray in a season of instability. And I want to also encourage all of us to really be attuned to a specific kind of prayer that we normally, as Christians, are not very good at praying. I'm not talking about the praying for the outcome we desire. We're usually very good at that kind of prayer. I'm actually talking about the prayer of lament, the prayer of grief.
Interesting.
I
like
because
that.
that actually is important for us to be ready to pray. Because as we've been talking about, no matter what the outcome is, even if it's the outcome we would prefer, there will be things to lament. I know I will have to lament, even in my most preferred outcome that Harris wins, lament that this means a certain, set of things that are going to be people who are going to be defenseless and vulnerable, who are going to be more defenseless and vulnerable, like the unborn. I have to lament that even in my preferred outcome. And then certainly in my feared outcome, there will be a lot for me to lament. And I think that's really important, because I have noticed when there are grievous things happening and I don't actually lament, that energy, that sadness goes out in really dysfunctional ways. It goes out in anxiety and worry, or it goes out in anger, and it goes out and I'm like really angry at the whoever my perceived enemies are, because I haven't actually done the work of lamenting this grievous event. And so we'll be doing some of that on the November 4th, the day before prayer times. And I really encourage you to really look for resources, look for opportunities to learn how to do prayers of lament, because this is going to be a day of lament, regardless of what happens. And that is the proper Christian response. David, thank you so much for being with us here as we prepare ourselves to make sense of Election Day. As always, you're such a gift to me personally, and a gift to our listeners, for injecting some much needed perspective. Not easy answers, but I think the right answers, or at least pointing directionally in the right way towards the kingdom. Thank you, David.
Thanks so much, Curtis. And thank you guys for joining us live. And thanks for those who are listening not live. One of the most wonderful things about the entire After Party project has been the community that has been created. And it's all over America. And I've been traveling a lot and speaking a lot all over America lately. And everywhere I go, somebody comes up from this community, this After Party community. And it's just, it's funny. It's like a reunion of old friends, even if we've never met. So I'm very blessed by you guys and very grateful for you guys.
And everybody, please remember, the After Party is a resource for the long term. We are playing the long game with the After Party. We don't talk about the election. We don't talk about the candidates. We are trying to reshape the Christian imagination and spirit in politics that I think will should last way beyond this election. So don't give up thinking about inviting people into the conversation around the After Party. I actually think going through the After Party after the pressure of the election and this sort of reduction of politics to this one binary choice is actually the more even healthier way to go through the After Party curriculum, is when we're out of that sort of narrowly artificial constructed definition of politics. So please consider inviting more people. Even if you've gone through the After Party, invite more of your friends, your family, other people in the church to join you for another round of the After Party. If you haven't done it before, please check it out. Go to after-party.org and join with us as we point our way to the true hope, the true kingdom of God, the true city of God that we know is coming, has broken through, and will come in its final full culmination in the final After Party of Jesus. And with that note, everyone, thank you for joining us. And next week, we will once again gather around the campfire.